Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends, and welcome, Elite Achievers, to the podcast where we dive into stories and lessons from today's most innovative authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders. Our topic this week is iteration. Webster defines iteration as a procedure in which repetition of a sequence of operations yields results successively closer to a desired result. Whoa. That sounds like a whole huge mouthful, and that's why I decided to bring on our new friend, Ed Muzio. Ed is the CEO of Group Harmonics and an award-winning 3-time author, an expert in the scientific study of measuring and modifying human behavior. He's a sought-after consultant to business and industry worldwide, a popular media source, and his mantra, higher output, lower stress, sustainable growth. His new book is Iterate, Run a Fast, Flexible, Focused Management Team. And today he is our modern leadership guest expert. Ed, it's so good to have you with us today. How are you?
Jake, I'm great. Thank you. It's great to be here with your audience, and I'm looking forward to talking with you. I enjoy your program.
Well, I just busted out this Webster definition of iteration, and it was such a mouthful that we've got to go down that path. But before we do, give us a little background on who you are. I know we read a little bit about your bio, your background business-wise, but how about you as a person?
Yeah, so by the way, you kind of blew me away with the Webster thing, so I'm happy to hear that. We'll have to talk about that. But who am I? So I worked about 10 years in technology before I got into what I'm doing now. My background is technical, so I have an engineering degree. And that was about 10 years ago, actually 15 years ago, that I got into this kind of work. So kind of both, I think, as a person and as a professional, I'm interested in enjoyable, productive, kind of, I guess, upbeat, helpful group interactions, right? Now, there's more of the productive and enjoyable and effective on the business side. There's more of the upbeat on the personal side. But I think the thread is there. I have a wife and a child. I live in Austin, Texas, and I enjoy people, and I think that is probably why I do what I do at work as well as outside of it.
Well, and you're a sought-after speaker, so you like to get up on stage and talk to people. You get on these podcasts, and so that's part of that communication dialogue that we're talking about here. So let's jump into this. So iteration, it's something that we hear. Sometimes it pops up as a buzzword in business, but I don't know that our listeners and myself really understand what we're talking about. So take us down this path. What is iteration?
Well, I always use the example, and it's a very simple example, of walking to your car. So imagine you walk out the door of a mall or maybe a big office building, and you sort of look off in the direction where you think your car is, and you look at your watch and you say to yourself, I need to get to my car in about 3 minutes. And so what do you do next? Well, the next thing you do is you start walking. This is probably the least interesting part of your day, but usually what happens is you end up getting to your car in about 3 minutes or less, and your day goes on without event. Now, if you think about kind of what's going on there, and I, of course, think in terms of the organization, you've got your sort of executives up at the top level, which is your brain, saying, get to the car in 3 minutes. And you have your workforce, which is your feet, saying, carry it out, do the work. And it sounds like it's just that simple. But if you actually think about what's happening during that process, that's where the iteration is. The iteration is every step leads to information, and every piece of information can adjust the course, right? So you've got your workforce doing the work, and they can make some decisions themselves. If there's a slippery surface or some gravel, your musculature down there, that part of your body, it adjusts without any request to management, right? It just does its thing. On the other hand, if you're moving so fast that those muscles need more blood oxygen, that's a resource. And you get what we might think of as a resource escalation, which is the leg muscles call for more. That escalation goes to, let's say, middle management, your cardiovascular system. Maybe your heart beats a little faster automatically, or maybe it's too big a request and you actually get the message up in your executive office, which is the message I get if I haven't been going to the gym enough, which is either breathe harder or walk slower, right? So you have this information going up. Now, at the same time, you're looking where you're going. You're noticing, oh, there's a hole. Oh, there's a tree in my way. Oh, there's some cars parked. I can't get around them. Oh, that's not my car. That's a different car than I thought it was. And you're feeding that information down. And so what's happening is iteration. Every step you take, you're getting a step further into knowing how to get to your goal, hopefully a step closer to your goal, not always. And every step that leads to information, the information feeds into the next step. So this is the same process that computers use to simulate weather movement, for example. Iterative modeling, you'll hear the term, which is do a round of calculations, draw the picture, and then chunk the next step from there. And this is what I mean when I talk about the way management runs effective organizations, which is everything's changing so fast around us all the time. The only way to actually get to our goals is iteratively. It is to keep adjusting our resources and our work to return to back on track toward where we're trying to go. Does that help?
It absolutely helps, and it's a great example. It helps us to understand and visualize what's going on. And so I want to jump into that analogy a little bit and ask you some of these questions. So as leadership is bringing on good people, and you're talking about the workforce. In the case of your example, you're talking about the legs, the feet that are moving in that direction. We're trying as management to bring on more talented, better people, A players that can kind of think and act for themselves. And so, part of what I hear you saying, and maybe it just needs clarification, is you've got management up at top saying, this is where we're going. Watch out for the tree. Watch out for the gravel. Where does the ability of your boots on the ground people to make decisions on their own come in?
Well, in the analogy, the watch out for the tree comes from the top because you see it, whereas the, adjust to the surface that you're doing right now comes from the bottom because you're in it. So I think you can carry that over and you can say, obviously we want good people at every level. We want the people near the top of the organization looking out further into the distance, metaphorically and really, right, further in time. We want the people at the bottom of the organization closely engaged with the output they're trying to deliver, but free to make decisions and to use discretion and judgment within the context of that output. So if I've got a factory worker who's working on, let's say 4 different product lines, that person should know enough about their goals that they can manage their own time for the day between the product lines, as opposed to paying someone to stand over them and tell them where to walk and what to do, right? For a couple of reasons. Number one, that person will be more engaged. Number two, that person will make better decisions. Number three, it's cheaper not to pay someone to watch them, right? So there's a lot of good reasons why you want discretion and judgment and intelligence at every step of the process. And by running in what I call an iterative way, you're giving every level of the organization a clear enough heading to say, this is where you're heading. Under this level, exercise your own discretion. That way we're not escalating everything. You can't escalate everything. It just creates pinch points at the top.
Well, and I think that's what we're seeing, right? Is we're seeing leadership and management that wants to have their finger on the pulse of everything that's going on. And so they're starting to manage down to such a level that they're managing the surface, the walking that we're talking about. Now, in this case and in this scenario, let's say management looks out and sees the car and they're saying, we got to head in an easterly direction to get there. But your boots on the ground people may have more information or different information than leadership does, in that they may know that if I stay to the right here, I can walk down the sidewalk to get to the car. How does that flow of information go back up to the top?
Well, again, the information has to flow in both ways. And we may be getting to a point where we have to switch over to a real business example. But conceptually, let's do that. It'll be a little easier. So let's say we have the person, the function at or near the top of the organization saying, go into product line B. We're not in it now. There's a market there. We need to go this way. And then somewhere in the bottom of the organization, we have this knowledge floating around that the things we have to make for product line B, we don't know how to make them, right? We need those two pieces of information to find each other, right? So whether, the top initiates and says, push this goal down, we're going for B, and then it reaches the bottom and the bottom has a chance to respond, or whether the bottom is sort of seeing these issues and is escalating, saying we're getting more demand for XYZ, and these aren't working out for us, whatever the initiation point is, we need that information flowing both ways all the time so that it joins up at the right level. So that, in this story, maybe somewhere in middle management, somebody says, hey, we got a problem here. We got an initiative sending us in this direction. We've got a capability problem in that direction. I need to either solve this at my level or kick it back up because these are incompatible, right? And that's the thing that doesn't happen in what I call the North American management model of organizations, which is, the boss says, let's go, and we go. And if I know something that contradicts that, I keep it to myself because I want to keep my head down and stay out of trouble. That may be good for me in the moment when I'm in that kind of a dysfunctional culture, but it's not good for the boss and it's not good for the company because eventually we discover that and we discover it too late, right? So we want to get those signals early and often. And that's what I'm talking about. I talk about iterative management is constantly gathering all the signals we have and saying, how does that affect our plans? What are we going to do differently?
And I think you've got the entire podcast audience nodding their head along with you as you were talking about, the knowing about management and boots on the ground, and the people boots on the ground keeping their head down, not bringing things up because they, what might be good in the long term is not good in the short term. And so let's shift this conversation a little bit and talk a little bit about your book and go into these 5 key practices of iterative management. And the first one is output and status broadcasting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the basic idea here, and there's a lot to these, and there's more detail in the book and on the website and everything else, but the basic idea of output and status broadcasting is a manager at any level can give what you might call an elevator pitch, a summary statement very briefly of the exact 3 to 7 outputs he or she is going to deliver with the resources under his or her control. That is the people, the dollars, the equipment.
Do these line up to KPIs?
They do and they don't. KPIs and MBOs and all those different things over the years, these sort of linked goal systems, they come from the same research. But the problem is they carry with them the implication that by building the goals, everything else happens by itself. And they lack some certain things. So for example, the second part of output and status broadcasting says, now that I have an output defined, I have to have a graph for that output, a visual display. And that graph has to carry 2 different versions of the future. So I can't just say, here's how many I made up until last week every week. And I can't just say, here's how many I made up until last week every week. And here's my plan line of what I'm supposed to do in the future. I have to have a third thing on there. I have to have a second line going into the future next to my plan line that says, here's my forecast. Or put in simpler terms, the plan is what I thought the future looked like when we last checked. And the forecast is what I now think the future looks like. So if those 2 lines are different, if I detect what we call a variance, which is a difference in the future I now expect relative to the future I used to expect, that's the rich area for management discussion, because that's where we say, we're sitting here today, we're looking forward. What can we do today with our resources to deal with the fact that the future has changed?
And how often would you change the plan line versus the forecast line? I mean, you've got one set, right? You've got your plan line set, and then you're constantly looking at the future forecast and adjusting according to, this is what we thought was going to happen. This is what's actually happening. And because of this is where we're at today, this is where we expect to go in the future. How often are you adjusting the plan line, which is the original line you started with?
Well, there's a couple ways to answer that. So the first thing to say about that is you're adjusting your forecast all the time, but it only matters when there's enough variance, right? So let's jump to the next of those 5 key practices, which is work preview meetings. These are the forward-looking meetings where these variances get discussed. And so we're going to be in a work preview meeting, and I'm going to put up my graph and say, I have this different understanding of the future now. If I'm bothering to make a report, and there's some specific information about, it's called OSERs, but how we make the report. So I make the report in a very brief format. I say to the group, here's what I'm doing. You knew that already. You've seen my graphs. Here's my future forecast. You know how to read my graph. You understand there's a difference here. Here's the issue, what I think is the root cause behind the difference. And here's my recommendation. I get that whole thing done in 2 to 3 minutes at most. And then that opens up the floor for discussion with my peers and my boss about what we're going to do about it, right? So if it's a small variance, I don't discuss it. If it's kind of a medium-sized variance, maybe we make a plan in the meeting. We make a sort of agreement that says, so-and-so is going to help me. We'll get it back on track, or maybe we don't care about it. It's not that big a deal, whatever. If it's a pretty big variance and we say, okay, we need to adjust what everybody else is doing. So Ed is not going to hit the output Ed thought he was going to hit. And Jake is dependent upon Ed's output for his work. So Jake is now going to adjust his work based on this new understanding of output. At that point, we start to look at that and say, maybe that's a new plan. Maybe we erase the old plan from now on and put the new plan. The decision of when exactly do you erase the old one versus carrying it is very case by case. But conceptually, what's important is anyone who's depending on me to produce something understands what I'm really going to do. And by the way, that drives trust as well as driving output.
And our most recent podcast right before this one was on trust, which the listeners can go back and dive into that. I want to ask you a little bit more about these work preview meetings. Now, are these the same as like a weekly checkpoint meeting? Is this between you and your immediate supervisor, or is this more of a formalized, like let's get in the boardroom and set up the projector or put up the screen?
Well, you can do it either way, and it's probably less formal than more in most cases, but that's it's okay either way. What's important is it's a regular check-in. It's not a quarterly review, right? It's not a dog and pony show. It's not a narrative update of everything we've done so far. It's a manager and his or her team of managers looking forward. And, back to your point about trust, if I say to you, I'm going to do this and then I do it, that's the way to build trust, right? Make and meet commitments. So it's everyone getting together saying, these are my commitments. Here's how I am or I'm not adjusting them. Here's where we need to make adjustments, making adjustments if needed, and then kind of taking essentially the next step in the iteration on a regular basis. So maybe it's every week, maybe it's every 2 weeks, maybe it's more than every week. But I don't ever advise anybody to implement another meeting. This is usually the replacement for a staff meeting. And you don't have to call it a work preview meeting if you don't want to. But if your staff meetings aren't looking forward, if they aren't spending more time in discussion about what to do and how to share resources than in presentation mode of what's already been done, then you've got a pretty serious problem.
Yeah, what you're talking about is not a report meeting where you come back and say, this is what I did, but more of a projection or a forecasting meeting, a preview, as you call it, that says this is where we're going based on what has happened in the past and the changes that we're implementing. Is that correct?
And yeah, exactly. And also, here's where our understanding of the future has changed, and here's my recommendation for what we as a group should do about that change, if anything.
Perfect. Okay, our third key practice of iterative management is group decision making, and this is so important. Tell us about this.
Well, so once we're in this meeting and once Ed comes along and says, I recommend that we take a little bit of Jake's budget money and put it over to my project so I can get back on track, right? Because I'm off track. That's going to require some group discussion. And we'll talk a little more about that in linked teams as well. But we need to have a group decision about that. And we have about 70 years of research and experience from academic to practical about how groups make good decisions. And the model is someone is the decider. It's usually the boss. The decider doesn't allow anyone to focus on convincing him or her, but instead says, focus on teaching me. So everyone, Ed, Jake, all of your peers, everyone teach me what you know about the situation. And then the decider listens to understand. We all talk in front of each other because sometimes I'll say something and that'll trigger you to say something. So we're all in the same room or the same call. And then once that process is done and the decider has convinced him or herself that all the information is on the table, then it falls to that person to make a decision, not a popularity-based decision. If you go into anything that looks like voting or popularity, then you're going back into that mode of telling people to convince the boss or to make alliances. And that's not information transfer, that's politicking, right? So stay in the mode of once the decider gets the information, the decider decides. And then second, the decider spends enough time with the group to make sure they have all understood both the decision and the rationale in the same way. That way, when these managers go off and implement with their teams, they're all implementing the same decision for the same reasons. So we have a greater chance of it being coordinated, of all, not playing the, I thought we said this kind of game, but actually getting it right.
So the decider will come to a decision and then say, my decision is that we do this, or our decision or our direction moving forward is this, and this is why? Is that kind of how they would conclude the meeting?
Yeah, that would be the beginning of the conclusion. And sometimes then there's some discussion of, there's a couple of games you can play. You can say, can we say back to each other the rationale if it's really complicated? One thing that I advise managers for complex decisions is say, okay, I've articulated the decision. I've explained my rationale. Now let's take a break. And now everybody please write down silently on some paper your understanding of the decision and the rationale.
It's like the telephone game.
Yeah, exactly. And let's see if we all have the same understanding because, we're talking about managers. These people run whole sections of the organization. Even the most well-meaning, people that are trying their hardest to be in the same page, you all know. I mean, people get mixed up, right? We all know that we misunderstand things and we understand things differently. And spending some time to make sure we've really got that decision down is the only way to ensure that each of us, me, you, and our peers can go back to our groups and say, okay, we as a management team decided this. Here's why. I may or may not personally agree. We can talk about that. But we as a management team made this decision for these reasons. And now we're going to follow this decision because we don't win by being out of lockstep with each other. We win by working in coordination. And that means sometimes we take action on things we don't personally agree with. So, here we are. And this is the direction.
Yeah, this is such an important topic, and I love this idea of getting feedback after the meeting, whether it's written on a piece of paper or everybody verbally talking back to the decider of what they understand the decision to be. Because as we talk about the telephone game and as we talk about, people hear what they expect to hear, and oftentimes you can say something what you think is the clearest way possible, and the listener is not going to take it because of their background, their experience, the story that they're telling, telling or what they're expecting you to say, they're not going to hear exactly what you're trying to say. This happens with me and my kids all the time. They think dad's going to say something. They run off and do it. And then I say, why did you do that? And they say, we thought you said this. So this leads us to our next key practice, which is the linked teams. And I want to ask you to take it back a little bit to a smaller team. A smaller team where you have people on the team that have different seniority, different roles and expectations. And like I told you in the pre-interview, I do a lot of consulting with law firms. And a lot of these, it's a lead lawyer, and then maybe they'll have a paralegal or an associate, or they'll have a receptionist that are all part of the team. And everybody pulls a certain weight within the office, but they don't all have the same background experience, nor does their opinion or teaching weigh as much into my decision process. Can you talk about that a little bit, especially as it relates to linked teams?
Well, one of the things that you just said something really important, which is there's something about how the decider makes, places weight and emphasis on different perspectives, right? And one of the key things about to finish up group decision making is that model of, there's a decider who listens, learns, and then decides, is that the decider uses their discretion to weigh things, right? So, it may be that in one discussion talking about something relative to the revenue of the company, the decider would weigh, to use your example, input from some of the partners generating business very much more heavily than input from the receptionist, the administrator. On the other hand, in the very next decision, which has to do with office logistics and mechanics, the decider might weigh much more heavily the input of a receptionist or an administrator or someone who really understands back office, and actually downplay in their own decision the input by the people that are running around generating the business, because they realize those people aren't as close to this, right? So it's a way, an important way of getting the right information on the table and having as much intelligence in the decision-making process as possible. Now, when we get into linked teams, we start talking about how those teams relate to each other. So if you've got, let's say, an admin pool, so you've got a leader of the admin pool who reports into the next level of the senior leadership, right? So that person who runs the admin pool is going to represent the entire output of the whole pool. And instead of each of those people being siloed into their own output, they're going to collaborate to achieve the overall output that team owes to the next level. That's the basic concept of linked teams. If we take it up to the management level, back to Ed and Jake working for a boss, Ed's got Ed's goals, Jake's got Jake's goals, but the boss has boss goals. And boss goals are what our whole group owes the next level of the organization. And so the boss says to us, hey, look, Ed, Jake, peers, you've got your own goals and you are responsible to your own goals. However, you as individuals and we as a team have not succeeded until we deliver my goals. So, Ed and Jake, if you want to have a debate about should Ed get some of Jake's budget to fix this project at the expense of that one, you should have that debate, have it in front of the group, have it in front of all of us. But I want to hear you talking about what's better for my plan, which is the team's plan. I don't want to hear Ed versus Jake. I want to hear Ed's perspective on how to accomplish boss goals versus Jake's perspective on how to accomplish boss goals, so that I can decide my best possible decision for boss goals, because boss goals are what we owe the higher level, and boss goals are what I have to feed in to my next level.
And this is difficult when you're leading a team of leaders. I mean, when you have strong personalities that are decision makers, helping them to understand that it's not about defending your kingdom. It's not about defending your silo or even your ego, but it's about what is right for the company, or as we're talking in this scenario, about the decider, what is best in the plan that we laid out for the organization, for the decider, not your individual kingdom that you're creating.
That's right. And, it's funny because, first of all, that's a choice, right? I mean, so if you mentioned law firms, there are law firms that run on a fiefdom model and it works, right? So every partner has their own world, and the person at the head of the whole thing believes that to be the optimal way to run that thing. I'm not here to say that's not right. What I'm here to say is if the person at the top of the thing is saying, I want all the different parts under me, whether it's, pieces of the law firm, whether it's pieces of my different organization, I need those pieces coordinating in order to get where we're going with this company. That's when I say, okay, in that case, you don't want fiefdoms. You don't want silos. You want all those people on that team held accountable at the next level up. And what that does when you do it that way, to go back to kind of our initial conversation, is now you've got the team under let's say the CEO or the head is looking up at the CEO's goals. The team under them are looking up at those goals. So instead of everyone looking down and micromanaging down, everyone is looking up And that lets the leadership look out, right? That they can look forward because everyone's working on the level above their head. Otherwise, we get a situation where everybody's chasing their employees around saying, is this done yet? Is that done yet? I have to stitch your output together to get my output done. Everyone's looking down. Nobody's looking forward.
And efficiency is gone. I mean, when you're spending your time chasing other people to get them to do their job, you're going to run low on efficiency. And the more that we can get people looking up and running in the direction on their own, I mean, everyone's still going to need some managerial oversight, but the lower that we can do that, the more we can empower our teams to run, the more efficient our time is going to be. And so this leads us to my favorite of the key practices of iterative management, and that is frontline self-sufficiency. So tell us about this one, Ed.
So frontline self-sufficiency is the last of the five. And it's sort of, in a way, a microcosm of the other four, because the other four say, here's how managers work with each other. They have clear goals, they have forward-looking meetings, they make group decisions, and they work as heads of teams, not as siloed individuals. Frontline self-sufficiency says, at the front of the organization, at the bottom, individual contributors, the frontline employees, they have clear output goals, which means they know what they're doing. They have self-managed feedback, which is to say, not managers giving them feedback, but they have the ability to detect their own progress without anyone telling them, right? So they have systems to keep track of how they're doing. They have control of resources, which means whatever they need to do the job, they have it. And as a result of those three things, colloquially speaking, I have what I know what I'm doing. That's the goal. I know how it's going. That's the self-managed feedback. And I have what I need. That's the resources. When I have those three things in place as a frontline person, now I can forecast my output. Now my boss walks in and says, how's it going? You can hit those targets on Friday. Can you do this much or not? I have a reasonable answer to that question because I'm not held up by approvals for resources, because I know how far along I really am, and because I understand what the endpoint is supposed to look like. And so I give a good forecast. That's the forecast. That's what feeds into that future line that we talked about on the graph in management to say, we really understand something about the future, and it is or it isn't different than what we thought it would be. Without that from the front line, the rest of it doesn't work very well.
And this is such a great topic. And like you said, we can only brush the surface of it. It's all in the book. Pick up a copy of the book, dive into this, understand these 5 key managerial strategies of the iterative process, practices of management. Before we jump to the next section, though, Ed, I wanted to ask you about structuring meetings. And I know you've got a strategy for successfully structuring meetings that allows for this kind of critical decision making and ensuring that commitments are carried out. What kind of strategies do you have for structuring your meetings for productivity?
Well, the thing I think that applies to meetings, and I mean, it's actually a headline that applies to the whole thing, but the thing to keep in mind is agility beats planning, right? Planning is good. Don't leave this saying Ed said planning is bad. Planning is good. But if you give me a choice to bet on a company where, they spent 4 months making a perfect plan, or to bet on a company that put together a pretty good plan, but they're much better at adjusting along the way, I'm going to bet the agile company every time because they're going to adjust where the other company can't adjust as quickly, right?
Every time.
Every time. That's right. So that's what the whole concept of iteration in management is about. In meetings, what that means is keep the focus on the future, right? So one important thing we say about these work preview meetings is we're going to have discussions of current status, and we're going to have discussions of history. And you can't ever eliminate those things, nor do you want to. But the focus of the meeting has to be on the future, so you minimize the other two. So maybe, we're going to have a discussion of current status because we're trying to figure out what to do about some variance in the future. And part of that figuring out is, where are we today? That's absolutely valid. Maybe we're going to go back into history because, a year ago we had the same kind of problem and we solved it this way or that way, or we developed, a headcount sharing model or something that we can carry forward, right? So again, we're going to have that conversation. But what we're not going to do is we're not going to let our meetings turn into some sort of narrative kind of, newsletter of history and current state or
a gripe session, right? Where you just sit there and talk about what's going wrong.
Or a brag session, what's going right. I mean, those are all equally bad, right? Because when you fill the airtime with Ed talking about what's going on in his area, right? And then Jake talks about his area and everybody takes 10 minutes to talk about their area, 5 of us, that's a 1-hour meeting. We never made a decision. We never looked at the future. We just kind of talked. So there's some specifics around, making sure we have engagement, following good problem solving models. There's some specific tools in the book around how to do that. But conceptually, what we're after is if your meeting isn't mostly looking forward, and if the time you're spending in the meeting isn't mostly in discussion about future issues and resource allocation adjustments to compensate for future issues, then you're missing something in your meeting and you're probably not getting where you want to be with long-winded narrative status updates.
And this is a great topic, and I challenge our listeners to take a moment and think about their meetings, their upcoming meetings. We've all got them. I've got 14 hours of meetings scheduled this week. Are we focused on the future? Are we looking towards what we can do to make our productivity more efficient? Are we creating a scenario where, our future forecasting is in an upward trajectory? If it's not, if we're spending way too much time reporting and focusing on either a gripe or a brag session, then we need to make those changes. And this is a great conversation, Ed. Unfortunately, as we look at our time, we're running a little bit short, and we need to make sure we save time for learning from leaders. It's the 4 questions that I want to ask at the end of every podcast. Are you ready for Learning for Leaders?
I am.
All right, our first question then. What is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table? What are you reading?
Do you prefer a fiction or a nonfiction?
I prefer, look, it's up to you. Both are great. What do you want to share?
I've always got one of each. So right now I'm on the business side. It's called The Insightful Leader by Carlson Ferguson. And it is a book about the opposite of play to your strengths, which is what happens when you overplay to your strengths. And I really like that because in my work as well, you talk about, this idea of managing individuals. If you do too much of that at the expense of serving as the system that coordinates the organization, then that's just as bad as not doing enough. And Ferguson has done a good job of articulating specific leadership strengths, for example, results orientation, and saying, here's what's good about it. Here's how you know if you've gone too far, and kind of dialing it back a little bit. I think that's unique content. I found it very, very useful.
Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating read of kind of walking that fine line. How about your fictional book?
I just finished something called Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and it's a post-apocalyptic kind of thing, which I'm not too big on, but she just does a phenomenal job painting a very compelling picture of just how interconnected we all are and how human this whole society is and how we take it for granted. And I really enjoyed that about it. It stuck with me quite a long time.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that. I do a lot of reading and I read a lot of business books. But one thing that I found that's really helped me, not just in business, but also to get a better night's sleep, is right before I go to bed, I read fiction. I read something that I'm going to enjoy, and I allow my mind to kind of rest and relax a little bit, because I'm a believer that when I close my eyes and my brain starts to work, that those insights and ideas from the day are going to come back and give me an opportunity to grow my business. But I also want to have a little bit of time for my brain to relax and recharge. So I appreciate you sharing that. How about your leadership superpower?
Well, I took your quiz, Jake, and I came out adaptable, but I decided I was going to add analytically adaptable, because I think that what I'm good at is sort of adapting the situation, but first, and not that I always get it right, by the way, but I try to first pay attention to not only do I need to adapt, but also in what direction, like what's required here, what would be helpful here. And I think, and I've been told that I'm fairly good at kind of reading that. So I'm gonna go with that. If you make me talk about myself, that's what I'll say.
Well, I love that you came out as an adaptable leader, because when I think of iteration, I think of it as adapting. I mean, when you talked about being forward-looking and having the ability to kind of pivot as needed, I mean, that's the adaptable leader. So I'm glad that you came out as the adaptable leader. And analytic adaptability, that's just fine in my book. How about a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something you live by?
My mentor said this, and it's actually one of the chapter openers in my book, and it's so simple, but it's so powerful. His name is William R. Daniels. I know him as Bill Daniels, and the quote is, "You can't bake a pie one slice at a time." And he would use that with managers to say, if I give Jake one piece and I give Ed one piece and we tell him go off and chase your goals by yourself and I'll put it together, it doesn't make any sense. We can't bake a pie one slice at a time. We got to do this together as a team. We work in teams. Back to linked teams. I just love that. I use it all the time.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Bill, I'm going to start using that myself. I'm sure he's listening, so I'm just giving him a heads up. All right. The final question then is the book that you most often gift to friends, family, or colleagues.
I thought about this one, and it kind of changes year to year, but the one I'm on right now is a little tiny book called Practicing Peace by Pema Chodron. It's a Buddhist-based book, although it's actually too short to really be anything other than some ideas. But there's a quote in there. She says, "We are all capable of becoming fundamentalists because we get addicted to other people's wrongness." And I just think that's so powerful in humanity, and also so powerful in the management work I do, where it's like we have to really, the more you get into this getting people to work together well, you start to realize we are in many ways different from each other. I mean, we have a lot in common, but we see the world really differently. We understand things differently. We hear things differently. And the more we can respect that with each other personally, and also in the processes we use in our business, the better chance we have of both getting somewhere and ending up somewhere we want to be, if you know what I mean.
We can't have within ourselves and within our minds all the solutions, all the answers. I mean, it's impossible. And the ability to look outside of ourselves and see what other people are teaching and experiencing and going through can help us to adapt and adjust and all of that. I couldn't agree with you more, Ed, and I appreciate that. Book gifted. Before we let you go today, I want to give you the last word. And Ed, how can we find out more about you?
Well, the book's website is iteratenow.com. My company is Group Harmonics, so you can also go to groupharmonics.com. Those are linked back and forth. Social media and stuff is all accessible from there. And you can really take a look at, in the book website in particular, at Iterate Now, there are some pretty good short videos where I explain different concepts, including the 5 practices, including the walk to the car. So you can go and watch those. They're 3 to 6 minute videos that kind of summarize it, and then you can read more about the book and how to get it as well.
Yeah, and your website's very well put together. I spent a little bit of time in preparation over there, and I really love what you're doing. Your ability to take these complex topics and really bring them down to our level where we're implementing them in our businesses, we're implementing them in our lives. Such an appreciation for what you do. Ed, thank you for being this week's Modern Leadership Guest Expert.
Jake, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure. I wish everybody well, and I hope you all have good luck in your next iteration.
All right, my friends, and a big thank you to Ed Muzio for coming on the podcast and talking about iteration. As we concluded the podcast, and I was thinking more about this idea of adaptability, and as Ed talked about analytic adaptability or iteration, and I think it's such a valuable trait as a leader, something that we really need in order to take our businesses to the next level, is this ability to adapt and adjust, to have this clear idea of where you want to get, but understanding that the journey there is going to require us to think outside the box a little bit. And I love this idea of looking outside of ourselves for examples and opportunities to grow and to develop. The one thing that he did mention that I loved, listen, learn, decide, the 3-step process. Listen to make sure that you've got all the facts straight, learn, and that's diving in. That's really pondering upon what you're learning, and then take it to the next level. Make that decision. Businesses grow at the speed of decision. So decide and act. All right, my friends, everything that we talked about can be found on the show notes for this episode. jakeacarlson.com/ML103, episode 103. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life, and of course, stay awesome. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.